All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. We'll try one more time. We're so glad to be here, and I know you're probably glad I'm not singing or having you sing tonight, but I do appreciate the opportunity to come up a couple months back and bring my oldest son and work with you guys on some fundamentals of singing and song leading, and I really appreciate that opportunity, and I enjoy that. That's fun. Preaching's not as fun, but we're going to do it anyway. I'm just kidding. It's all fun. I'm glad to be here tonight with my wife. The first time she's been able to be up here with me, and she's really a good help. I'm glad to have her, and if you hear screaming in the back, it's our youngest son, Benjamin. He's here too. So we've got a part of the family here tonight. I was thinking as I got into my lesson prep for tonight that if I would have been more sly, I would have probably named my lesson instead of Mount Moriah, probably would have said the place we will go would be the threshing floor. That would have been a better place to do what we're going to do, but I've sort of let the cat out of the bag and already sort of given you a hint as to where we're going to go. But if I ask you tonight, what do you know about Mount Moriah? Is this a Bible class or we got some interaction? What would you say? If I said, hey, what do you know about Mount Moriah in the Bible? What would you say about that place? Know anything about it? Couple quick facts about Mount Moriah. Anything important that happened there? All right. Well, I was hoping to get that response. If I said Mount Moriah, some of you Lord of the Rings fan might say, well, that's where the dwarves mined too deep and found the Balrog. But if you're a Tolkien fan, you might get that. If not, then let's just get into our lesson. And so tonight we're going to be talking about Mount Moriah. And we're going to be talking about one of the central places in the Bible where multiple things you're already familiar with are going to sort of intersect. And to tell this story tonight and to begin, we are going to look in a couple of different directions. Let's see here. I did not get any movement. So what I'm going to do, if we could we forward one slide, please? And when we're thinking about Mount Moriah, at first as we begin tonight, we may not be familiar with this place. We may not be familiar with what's going on here. But I'm hoping to kind of unfold this in the next 20 minutes or so. And then we'll kind of talk about why this location is important. And so the first place we'll be turning today is 2 Samuel chapter 24. 2 Samuel chapter 24. If you're taking notes, you might want to jot down the corresponding story in 1 Chronicles 21. We're not going to have time to go over and read that, but it's the same event told from a couple of different perspectives. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 24, the event that happens in this chapter, it's at the very end of David's life. And David has had a lot of ups, and then he has a lot of downs, and redemption arc and all that. But at the very end of David's life, you may remember that there's this strange thing that happens, and it could be its own Bible class, that David takes a census. And God is not pleased with the census. God, in fact, because of the census, God brings a plague on the people of Israel. And the people are dying. And we see here that as this happens, that David is upset. He realizes I've sinned. And he wants this plague or this pestilence to stop. There were something like 70,000, verse 15 of 2 Samuel 24. 70,000 people died in this pestilence or plague. And so when you think about this punishment that God's doling out, it's quite extreme. And so God tells David to go and make an altar. This is in verse 18 where our text begins tonight. And Gad the prophet goes to David and says, go up and raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Now, if you go over to 1 Chronicles 21, he's got a different name there. Probably just a different part of his name that they use, quite common in the Bible. But we see here that David is told to build an altar on the threshing floor of this Jebusite man. And so David goes, you may remember the story, and he goes and offers to buy the threshing floor. But Araunah says, I am going to give it to you. And we have one of the great lines in the Bible where David says, I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that costs me nothing. In other words, David says, I'm not, and it's a great teaching text that, when we offer things to God, it should cost us something. A sacrifice is a sacrifice for a reason. But the point we want to observe today is that this man is called a Jebusite. He's a Jebusite. And this is the location that David secures to build. Oh, we're working now. Great. David secures this location to build this altar that stops the pestilence. And so just sort of store that back in your brain, and we're going to kind of move forward tonight. The next place we're going to go is over in 2 Samuel. We're going to go backwards to chapter 5. Backwards to chapter 5, beginning in verse 3. Now remember, Araunah was a Jebusite. And so when we talk about this man being a Jebusite, we say, well, what was a Jebusite? It's one of those ites. I remember one time I was in a Bible class when I was a young man, and somebody asked about the Perizzites or the Hittites or the Jebusites or the Canaanites, and somebody said, well, what about these? And he said, all those ites were the same. It's one of those ites. But the Jebusites were actually one of the tribes that lived in Canaan. And you may remember if you read the book of Joshua, when Joshua comes in, he makes a westward push, he makes a northern push and then a southern push, but he doesn't drive out all the inhabitants. The children of Israel start settling before they drive all of those Canaanites out. And so, of course, when David comes around a few hundred years later, there are still natives of the land living among the Israelites. And this man is a Jebusite. He's living in this area. Now, there's debate on his nationality, but he's called a Jebusite. But back in chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, if you go back a few chapters, we read here in verse 3 that all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. So at this time, David is down south in the tribe of Judah at the city of Hebron. Now, you go back to the book of Exodus, also the book of Joshua, you may remember that Hebron was one of the 6 cities of refuge. I don't have time. Boy, I want to just go into all this, but we've got a limited schedule, so we're going to have to move on. But Hebron was one of the 6 cities that God had set up as a city of refuge if there was a dispute about an accidental death, for instance. And the case that God gives is 2 men are chopping wood and the axe head comes off the handle, strikes one man in the head. The man who was swinging the axe could run to this city of refuge, and the avenger of blood, that is the nearest kin of the dead man, had the right, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, to kill the man who killed his brother or father or whatever. But he could go to that city of refuge, tell the elders of the city, hey, it was an accident, we were chopping wood. It was essentially what we would call today maybe something like manslaughter. And then the elders would decide, and he could stay there until the next high priest was appointed. And then once the next high priest came in, he was free to go. Kind of some interesting history there. Of interest, all the names of those 6 cities of refuge, 3 on the west bank of the Jordan, 3 on the east, all of those names mean something that is a characteristic of Jesus. And so that's something interesting if you want to dig into the 6 cities of refuge. But at this time, David is set up as king in Hebron. And so he makes a covenant with the people there. And we read that he was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. And in verse 5 of 2 Samuel 5, we read that at Hebron he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the... If you're following along, this is verse 6 of 2 Samuel 5. The king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. Now, the threshing floor was bought where? From a Jebusite. David had gone to destroy the Jebusites and drive them out of the land, And what was their stronghold? What city was it? It's what we now call Jerusalem. And at that time it wasn't Jerusalem. We'll get to that in a little bit, but it's going to be called Jerusalem when the writer of 2 Samuel pens his work. And so when we look at this threshing floor that David buys at the end of the book, if you know your history of the book, you could say, oh, he bought the threshing floor and set up the altar in the city of Jerusalem. Okay? So now we have a little more history here. But let's move a little further into our study. And so when we go to our next slide, we're going to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 3. 2 Chronicles chapter 3. Jumping around a little bit tonight. And so we have these events that are going to stack up on us. Now in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, we read this. Then Solomon, of course remember Solomon we all know is David's son. David wanted to build a house for God's name, but God would not allow him. David's kingdom had been too bloody. And so what God did, he made a compromise with David. And he told David that he could not build the house, but that he could assemble the building materials. And in 2 Samuel 7, in a messianic prophecy, verses 12 through 14, Samuel tells David that his son, who would come from his body, would build a house after his time. And there's sort of one of those prophecies with a dual fulfillment. It's immediately speaking of Solomon building the temple, but secondarily, it's an image of Jesus coming from David and building the new temple, the church, right? And so here in 2 Chronicles 3 rather, we read, and this is the only verse in the Bible that's going to tie this together for us, by the way, tonight. It says, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in, where? Jerusalem. That territory belonged to what group of people? Jebusites. On where? Mount Moriah. Well, let me ask you again. Do you know of anything important that happened on Mount Moriah? Well, now we know several things, right? Because we know that Jerusalem sits on Mount Moriah. Furthermore, Solomon builds the temple on Mount Moriah. And so far tonight, as we've opened up our Bible study, we've already noted, number one, the first thing we looked at, that David built an altar to God in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah at the site of the temple that Solomon would build to stop the plague that had already killed 70,000 people. Let's bury that in our brain. And we've gone forward, and now in 2 Chronicles 3, we have noted that Solomon owned that site where his father had bought the threshing floor from the Jebusite, and David had driven the Jebusites out, that Solomon builds the temple. And if we read further into the text, if you go back and read the story of Solomon, you may remember that when he builds the temple, there are literally tens of thousands of animals that are sacrificed in that temple, and it becomes a place of sacrifice and offering, and also a place where God's presence, the Shekinah, makes itself known. And so God dwells in the midst of his people Israel at Mount Moriah. And so a lot's going on in this geographic location in the Old Testament. But as the old, TV commercials used to say when I was a kid, but wait, there's more. And so when we think about Mount Moriah, we see that, yes, it's a place where there was a threshing floor. Yes, it's a place where David drove out the Jebusites. Yes, it was a place where David became king. But it's also going to become the city of Jerusalem and the site of Solomon's temple, one of the great wonders of the ancient world. And so as we move forward into our study tonight, we're going to go backwards, actually. And so I hope you don't mind going forward and backwards, forward and backwards, forward and backwards. But it's very important as we put these details together. And so tonight, the theme was the places we'll go, right? I was wanting to travel a lot through our Bibles. And so let's go back to Genesis 14 for just a moment. And in Genesis 14, we have another very interesting story. And tonight we're tying a lot of these little stories together, and we're coming away with some interesting information. Now we're going to begin in Genesis 14 and verse 17. Now to set the stage, we have just begun the Abram narrative in chapter 12. He's introduced at the end of chapter 11, but the story really kicks off in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, with the promise that God makes to Abram. But there's sort of an interlude here, because when Abram gets out from his father's house and goes to this far country, who does he take? Does he go by himself? No, he takes a lot of his family with him. And one of the characters he takes is going to become important in chapter 19, 18:19, and that's his nephew, and his name was what? Lot. Well, if you remember, Lot gets kidnapped. In chapter 13, Abram and Lot, both of them, God's blessing them within a chapter. Their herds are growing and their servants are growing. Everything's just doing well. Business is great. And they sort of say, hey, we're getting a lot of animals here. Why don't we sort of split up so that we're not mixing up animals all the time? We don't want to have fights in between our shepherds, things like that. And so you may remember that's when Lot decides to sort of head down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abram goes another direction. Well, what ends up happening is that they end up getting in the middle of sort of a war, and it's a very interesting story in chapter 14, but Lot gets kidnapped. And one of the interesting things in the Old Testament that we often don't teach in VBS, we don't teach in our Bible classes, is that men like Abram and Moses were actually a lot like what we might call an ancient warlord, as well as a spiritual leader. Because Abram is going to get together an army and go in and go to war with these kings that have effectively taken Lot and rescue his nephew. And so all of that goes on. A very interesting story, but our point of the story is in verse 17 that Abram is coming back from rescuing Lot. That's verse 16 of chapter 14. And so in verse 17 it says, after his return from the defeat of, and I don't know how to say that. It's one of those Old Testament, one of those ites. But anyway, one of the kings who was in this confederation, they go, and the king of Sodom comes out to meet Abram in the valley of Shavah. That is the king's valley. And now we're introduced to this interesting character in the Old Testament. The only time he's mentioned in narrative form. Now, he's mentioned in the Psalms, but he's not mentioned any other place in narrative form. We don't know any history or background or anything about it. In fact, that's a point that the writers of Hebrews is going to make in Hebrews chapter 7, is that we don't have a genealogy, we don't have a backstory, we don't have a history. He just sort of pops up on the scene. And so there's been so much speculation about this, but let's not miss the stuff that's here. So Abram's coming back from winning this battle, rescuing Lot. The king of Sodom comes down in the valley to meet him and say, hey, great job, you won the battle. We're safe from these confederation of kings. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. I want you to bookmark that in your brain. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out two things: bread and wine. And just sort of bookmark that in your brain. In fact, as New Testament people, if we're familiar with the New Testament stories, that ought to sort of pop and come off the page. Just hold on to that for just a moment. And we also read in verse 18, which is a very informative verse. We're going to learn a lot about this man in one verse. He's the king of Salem. And it says in parentheses, he was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Now, this story is extremely important. We see that there's some more discussion going on here, but we see here that what happens is that Abram is blessed by Melchizedek. And where is Melchizedek the king of? He's the king of Salem. Well, over in Psalm 76, the other text we have there on the screen, we have an interesting passage that's important for us to go and read. Now, remember, Melchizedek was the priest of God Most High. And you might say, well, okay, so he's the priest of God, even though he wasn't with Abram, who's sort of God's man in the story. There's a couple of men who are priests of God in our Old Testament who aren't with God's people. This is the first one, Melchizedek. The second one, of course, is Moses' father-in-law, who's a priest of Midian, who seems to be a priest of God there at the mountain of God near Sinai, but he's not with the Israelites. And so I've heard people say over the years that, well, God sort of abandoned the Gentiles, that he was only interested in Abram and his family. That's absolutely not true. God cared about all people groups in the Old Testament. That's one point we could make. But let's get back to our narrative. So in Psalm 76, in verse 1, we read, "In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in..." What word do y'all have there? Salem. His dwelling place in Zion. Now, this is a Hebraism here in the poetry. And a lot of times there will be something repeated in Hebrew poetry where they will say the same thing two different times and use different words. I might say it like this. I'm not a Hebrew poet. I'm not an English poet. But it would sound something like this. "Tonight, I brought a lovely woman with me. Tonight, my wife made the journey." Okay? Now, did y'all see what I did there? Number one, I buttered up my wife publicly. But number two, what I did was I described her in one sentence and I talked about the same person in another context in the next. That happens a lot in your Bible. This is one of those instances of that happening. And so we read here that God in Psalm 76 establishes his home or abode in Salem, and his dwelling place is in Zion. Well, where's Zion? And where did God make his abode? In the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Okay? And so when we go back and read about Melchizedek being the king of Salem, where, prior to David ever driving the Jebusites out, where was Melchizedek the king of? He's the king of Salem or Jerusalem. It will be called Jerusalem later. At that time, it was just called Salem. And so this psalm here ties together the location of Salem and calls it Zion. By the way, bookmark that in your brain for later. All right. Let's do some more traveling through our Bibles. In Genesis chapter 22, we read that Abram has been given a son. His first son was born to him by his wife's handmaid, Hagar. Ishmael was not the son of promise. In fact, he's born in chapter 16, and immediately in chapter 17 in the narrative, God has him be circumcised. I think there's some imagery there. God is saying, I'm going to cleanse you, and I'm going to set you apart, and you will, through your offspring, have a son that I will give you, and you won't take matters into your hands. At any rate, Isaac is born. And we read in verse 1 of Genesis 22 that after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Interesting. This is called the binding of Isaac by the Jewish rabbis. You remember the story? Isaac carried the wood up the mountain, was put on the altar. His father willingly gave him up, and he brought the knife up to slay the child. And God provided a ram caught in the bushes, and Isaac was spared that sacrifice. And yet, when we talk about Abraham in the New Testament, we read that by faith Abraham offered, past tense, his son Isaac. In other words, Abraham had already done the thing in his mind. He believed and trusted God. And so here's another story that happens in the mountains of Moriah. And so we've covered a fair amount of ground. Now I have 4 passages on the screen here, and we don't have time to read them all. But we'll go to the Matthew passage in Matthew 27, 32 through 34. But it's interesting to me that all 4 of the Gospels record this interesting fact we're going to read here tonight. We read in verse 32 of Matthew 27 that as they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and they compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments. Now, the place Golgotha, or the place of a skull, is mentioned here. It's mentioned in Mark 15, 21, 22, Luke 23, 32 and 33, and also in John 19. We get our word Calvary from this listing when the Latin was preserved in our English Bibles. But the word Golgotha means the place of a skull. Now, tonight, we're going to go into a place that is a little speculative and a little historical and not biblical. I hope you're okay with that. I always, when I tell some history or speculation, I always want to lay that out. Don't take this and put it on Facebook and say, that preacher said the Bible says this, okay? But Jewish tradition and early Christian tradition taught that the reason Golgotha was called the place of a skull was because Adam's skull was there. In other words, Adam, the first man, was buried on Mount Moriah. I think I have this slide in my... I didn't make it in here. Okay. I'll just make a mental note for you. I forgot to paste this in. You can search crucifixion art skull. Just those 3 words. Crucifixion art skull. And on Google or wherever you want to search, ChatGPT, whatever. And you're going to find a plethora of artwork throughout the years that will show Jesus, and we'll have a picture of it before the end of this class, on the cross, and there being a human skull under that cross. And part of the reason is because there was this tradition that Adam had died, and the idea is this metaphor that the blood of Jesus covered the sins of Adam, and Adam's the metaphor for all mankind. You know, Jesus is the second Adam. It's kind of an interesting artistic pitch, if nothing else. No proof that Adam was buried in Jerusalem. However, we do read in 1 Samuel 17:54 that when David killed Goliath, that he cut off his head there in the valley of Elah and carried his head back to, guess where? The city of Jerusalem. And so some people see that Jesus being crucified at Golgotha was the skull of Goliath. I even saw a video not long ago that said, look at it, Golgotha even sounds like Goliath of Goliath. That's not how etymology works. That's not true. If you see that video, don't share it. Don't believe everything you know. Abraham Lincoln said only believe 30% of what you read on Facebook. And so be careful about that. But there is some interesting ties there in history. We don't know. Some people say that it was called the place of the skull simply because the rock was shaped like the top of the cranium in that place. A lot of different speculation. We don't know. But what we do know is that Jesus was crucified and sacrificed on the same mountain where Abraham bound his son and where David stopped the plague at the altar, and where Melchizedek was the high priest and king of God, and where Solomon built the temple. You see, Mount Moriah is a place of sacrifice, of God's presence, of God's mercy, and of God's grace to his people. in the Old and the New Testament. It's always been that place. It's been the place where God comes to meet with man and extend to man His mercy and His grace. That other bell is going to get me, so I'm going to stop and I'll save the rest for the devotion. Thank you very much.